Welcome to the Dragon Soul Breakdown series. These breakdowns will give you a detailed insight into the Dragon Soul 10-man heroic encounters. In this video, I'll break down the Spine of Deathwing encounter so that you have the tools to get the fight done. During the guide, I'm going to cover the entire fight mechanically, as well as giving you a recipe for how to finish the encounter in its entirety. This fight consists of 3 or more or less identical phases. Each phase will be divided into a preparation stage and a burst stage. The preparation stage will have you managing adds, which will eventually give you the opportunity to lift one of Deathwing's armor plates, and when the armor plate is lifted, an add called Burning Tendon will appear, which will be your burst stage in which you try to kill this add. Once the Burning Tendon is dead, the armor plate will be removed, and you'll be sent to the next phase where you'll repeat the pattern. You'll remove a grand total of 3 armor plates, which will mark the end of this encounter. In terms of composition, you'll run 2 tanks, 3 healers, and 5 DPS. Your DPS composition will heavily favor classes which have strong burst windows, since the phase transitions are based on your ability to kill the Burning Tendon within a short time frame. Due to the repetitive nature of this fight, we'll address each phase separately towards the end of the guide. But before then, let's cover the mechanics which are shared throughout the entire fight. In order to fully comprehend the mechanics, we first need to take a look at the arena of the fight. The size of the arena will grow for each phase when an armor plate is removed, but in general, you should take mental notes of the symmetry of the arena. Since you're playing on the Spine of Deathwing, the center line of the arena will be indicated by the vertebrae of Deathwing's spine. The first mechanic is called Roll, and it's based on how your raid is positioned according to the center line of the arena. If you are balanced, meaning that you either stack on the center line or if you stand in equal parts on opposite sides of the center line, the roll mechanic will not occur. However, if you were to shift your raid towards either side of the center line, Deathwing will try to shake you off and force a roll 5 seconds after causing an unbalanced position. When Deathwing rolls, he'll throw the raid and certain adds off his back, effectively causing a wipe if the raid is to be thrown off. While this might sound extreme, you can take measures which will prevent you from being rolled off the back despite being in an unbalanced position, which we will cover soon. It's also worth noting that there's a certain distance you can travel to either side of the center line, essentially spanning the width of the vertebrae where you're safe from forcing a roll even if you move away from the center line. If you were to move beyond this point, it will cause an imbalance on the spine and you're at risk of forcing a roll. Apart from the general roll mechanic, Deathwing also places a debuff on random players every so often. The debuff is called Blood Corruption Death. It lasts for 15 seconds or until it's dispelled, and it will essentially do nothing while it's on its target. However, if you were to let the debuff expire, it's going to wipe your raid, so your healers will definitely want to keep an eye on the debuff timer. When the debuff is dispelled, it's going to jump to a random target and refresh the duration, or it will mutate to a new debuff called Blood Corruption Earth. The Earth debuff is quite different from the Death debuff, since you'll not want to dispel this debuff from anyone who has it. Once the debuff timer of Earth expires, it will give the target a 20% damage reduction buff for the remainder of the fight, stacking up to 2 times. The buff you gain from the expiration is called Blood of Neltharion if you're interested in tracking these. If you accidentally were to dispel the Blood Corruption Earth, it's going to behave the same way as the Death, jumping to a random target, refreshing the duration, but at risk of mutating back to Blood Corruption Death. What this essentially means is that you're going to try to get Blood Corruption Earth onto your tanks as early as possible in the fight, and you'll never dispel the Earth debuff if anyone else gets it. So how do we force the debuff to bounce to the tanks? Here, we have to revisit the concept of the center line of Deathwing. In general, the debuff has a tendency to bounce across the center line of Deathwing, meaning that if a debuff target is on the left side of the center line, it will more likely jump to a target on the right side of the center line. In broad terms, this means that your tanks will want to be standing on one side of the center line while the raid will be on the opposite side until both tanks have 2 stacks of Blood of Neltharion. Now that we've taken a look at the 2 general mechanics which will be prevalent for the entire duration of the fight, let's take a look at the add types and how we deal with each add type. In total, we have 4 add types which all play a crucial part in progressing through the phases of the fight. If we quickly have a look at the arena, you'll see these fire pits, for lack of a better word. Anyway, in phase 1 we will have 4 fire pits, phase 2 will have 6, and phase 3 will have 8. At the start of the fight, each of these 4 fire pits will be occupied by a corruption ad. Once a corruption is killed, the fire pit will be empty. However, if there's less than 1 corruption alive, a random fire pit will spawn a new corruption, essentially meaning that you'll start each phase with several corruptions and maintain a minimum of 1 alive per phase, since they respawn if all are killed. So, the corruptions have around 800,000 HP and use 2 distinct mechanics. The first mechanic is called Searing Plasma. This is an 8-second repetitive cast which places a 280,000 healing absorb on a random player. Simple enough, you'll keep constant heals on the raids to deplete the healing absorb so that you can top your raid before big damaging abilities. The absolutely best way to deal with this is for your Holy Paladin to glyph into Beacon of Light, place it on whoever gets the debuff, and then heal another debuff players with Holy Light. In terms of bang for buck healing, this is the optimal way of dealing with it, but I would not recommend your group to leave this task to the Holy Paladin alone. Any healer who can place strong HOTS on players will help significantly, for example, Shaman's Riptides and Druid's Rejuvenation. Disc Priests can help by shielding players if needed to keep them healthy before bursty damage, but this mechanic should require very little attention and simply dictate parts of your healing priority. Secondly, the corruption will cast Fiery Grip every 30 seconds. The Fiery Grip is a channeled effect which incapacitates a random DPS or healer while dealing moderate damage. The channel is going to last until it's broken, which is when the corruption has taken 120k damage in total. The mechanic itself is quite harmless, but it's a tempo breaker and you want to ensure that this mechanic does not occur during the burst stage of the phase, so that all your DPS players can focus on DPS output rather than breaking the fiery grips. Once a corruption is killed, 2 things will happen. First, the fire pit will become vacant and you can use this to prevent being thrown off Deathwing's back during the roll mechanic. When you step into the fire pit, you'll be slowed, take moderate damage per second, and receive the buff called Grasping Tendrils, essentially making you immune to the roll mechanic. The use of this seatbelt type mechanic will be explained in the walkthrough section of the guide, but you should avoid standing in it for too long as the damage taken is quite high over time. The second thing that will happen when a corruption dies is that it's going to spawn the second ad type called Hideous Amalgamation. The amalgamations are your key to the kingdom and you need to charge them up so that they explode. When they explode, they're going to lift the armor plate of Deathwing for 20 seconds, and this is going to be the start of your burst stage, and it's the only way to transition to the next phase. In total, you're going to need to charge up 2 amalgamations in order to transition due to the very high damage requirement in the burst stage, and if you were to fail in 2 charges, I would recommend wiping and trying again. The amalgamations themselves have quite high HP at approximately 10 million, and will essentially just swing on the target with the highest threat. However, when they're charged up, they gain Superheated Nucleus, which is a buff, and it's going to start pulsing very high raid-wide damage until it's killed. Upon death, the amalgamation will cast Nuclear Blast, which will one-shot anyone in an 8-yard range after a few seconds. When it dies, it also applies a stack of Degradation to the raid. Degradation is a permanent debuff where each stack reduces your max health by 5%, and it's going to stack indefinitely through the encounter, so you want to minimize the amount of amalgamations that you kill. So how do we actually charge up the amalgamation? Let's answer that by taking a look at the third ad type called Corrupted Blood. These are going to spawn from any of the vacant fire pits every so often, and will continue to do so throughout the entire encounter. The ads themselves are quite harmless as they do very low damage with melee swings and only have around 300k HP, but their strength comes in numbers. When a Corrupted Blood dies, 2 things will happen. The first thing that happens is that the blood will burst and it deals very low raid-wide damage. Secondly, it's going to leave a residue on the ground. The residue will travel slowly towards the nearest vacant fire pit, and once it comes in contact with the fire pit, the blood is respawned. What this essentially means is that you will not get rid of a blood once it's killed, but rather, you will stagger the amount that are alive at any given time. While there is a constant spawn rate of new bloods, you'll also have a spawn rate from all the residues which respawn a blood. So towards the end of the fight, you'll have a lot more bloods than in the beginning. You cannot use soft CC on the bloods, but stuns are very effective to break up the tempo. I'm going to talk about blood management a bit more in the walkthrough at the end of the guide. We've already declared that we need to charge up an amalgamation to such that it casts Nuclear Blast and lifts an armor plate so that we can enter the burst stage. In order to do so, we need to pull the amalgamation over 9 residues on the ground, which will prompt the superheated nucleus until the amalgamation dies. You should note that each residue that the amalgamation soaks up, it's going to give it a stacking buff which increases its damage by 10% and attack speed by 20% per stack. This means that you will want to avoid soaking any residues with the amalgamation until you can quickly pick up 9 in total, such that the damage output from the amalgamation is kept within a tight time frame. And this is going to bring us to our final add type, being the sole feature of the burst phase. Once Nuclear Blast is finished casting, it's going to lift an armor plate and a burning tendon will spawn. The tendon keeps the armor plate attached to Deathwing, so by killing the tendon, you'll be able to transition to the next phase. The tendon will be exposed for 20 seconds, so you really need to channel as much quick damage into it as possible. You can track the duration of the burst stage by the channeled effect on the tendon called Seal Armor Breach. When it's finished channeling, you'll return to the preparation stage, repeating the pattern of killing bloods and soaking residues with an amalgamation to lift it again. I would recommend to kill the tendons in either 1 or 2 attempts, since it retains its HP between occurrences of the plate being lifted. Strong groups might be able to kill the tendon in 1 attempt, but less optimized groups will definitely need 2 attempts to get it down. If you were to fail getting it down in 2 attempts, I would highly recommend wiping and trying again, since the growing number of corrupted bloods will overwhelm you towards the end of the fight if you prolong the fight too much. You're going to repeat the pattern throughout 3 phases, and the fight will end once the tendon under the 3rd armor plate is killed. While all of these mechanics could sound quite overwhelming, I'm going to give you a walkthrough to explain the rhythm and some strategies which will help you in getting the job done. Starting off, we'll be dropped into the arena and we will aim to kill 3 corruptions except for the top right one if you're facing the plate. Once the corruptions die, the tank picks up the spawned amalgamations and the raid forces are rolled towards the left such that the amalgamations are thrown off Deathwing's back. Here, it's important to step out from the center line without dipping into the fire pit to minimize the damage taken, since the roll is a 5-second cast. We stack up just off the center line to bait the roll and dip into the fire pit with 1 or 2 seconds left and blow a raid cooldown to mitigate the damage taken. Once the amalgamations are thrown off, we're free to move and kill the remaining corruptions so we can get an amalgamation for which we can prepare to charge up. We also kill the second corruption, so that we have 2 amalgamations up and can utilize our cleave damage to lower both amalgas instead of having downtime during the phase. The off tank is positioned near the plate to pick up all the bloods. We kill them near the plate and as close to the center line as possible to ensure that the amalgamation is near the plate when it starts picking up residue. We choose to kill the bloods near the center so that the respawn time is as long as possible. Phase 1 is a fairly straightforward at this point, and you'll have a lot of downtime where you're breaking fiery grips and waiting for a total of 9 bloods to spawn. Once the 9th blood has spawned, you're going to track the fiery grip timer, and the off tank taunts the amalgamation, which is the lowest HP, about 5 to 10 seconds before the next grip comes out. We soak up the residue and blow up the amalgamation near the plate. During its cast of Nuclear Blast, we want to trigger the fiery grip. And since the cooldown is 30 seconds, we can ensure that we'll not have another grip while the tendon is exposed, and our DPS players can optimize their uptime on the tendon. As soon as the amalgamation gets to 9 stacks of absorbed blood, we use a raid cooldown to mitigate the raid-wide damage. After a while, the plate closes, and we already have some residue on the ground, so we wait for the final bloods to spawn, lower the amalgamation, and prepare to repeat the process. Once any plate is removed, we repeat the exact same pattern of killing all corruptions except the top right one, rolling off excess amalgamations, spawning 2 new ones, and cleaving them down. We kill the bloods near the plate, and move the amalgamation over for soaking the residues before it explodes. What does change is that we delay the roll slightly between phases, such that we can pick up the amalgamations which spawned before we roll, and then we kite them over any excess residue on the ground before rolling them off, so that the residue or the bloods are permanently removed from the fight. The final and very crucial aspect of this fight is to manage your bloods properly. I'd recommend that you put on your big boy pants and just tank them in the front of the spine, using stuns to buy some time and ensuring that you're asking your raids for help with DPSing the bloods down to maintain a low amount at any given time. Your DPS players needs to be cautious of blowing up too many bloods at a time due to the burst mechanic, but killing 5 or 6 bloods in rapid succession should not be an issue at any point of the encounter. Towards the end of the fight, you'll be slightly overwhelmed by the bloods, so make sure that you're kiting them around the spine if you have to. A great method to do so is to run to the opposite sides on the center line, stun the bloods, and then use a movement speed boost to run back to the opposing side. And that wraps up the Spine of Deathwing 10-man heroic encounter. I want to thank you all for your continued support during the last couple of months. I'm going to continue uploading and refining my Dragon Soul guides for the upcoming months, after which I will switch focus to mob content, so make sure to drop a subscription so you don't miss out. You should leave a like if you enjoyed the video and comment if you have requests for future guides. See y'all next time.